right, we have a very intimate session today to talk about the question of protecting the rights and ensuring the future of generation AI. So I'm very pleased to see you today and to have our panelists. My name is Karl Merck, and I co-direct FARI AI for the Common Good Institute. This session is patroned by AI for Belgium. With my colleagues Nelly Roekens and Jelle Hoedemakers, we organized this session. And it was a very important topic, and I think even more in the Belgian context where we are trying to think of how to make the AI scene more cohesive, but also how to put forward some important topics when it comes to AI. I will have the pleasure of presenting our speakers in a second. I will just start with a general introduction of why we organized this session and why it was important to us. So, as you can see, we have today Liliana Carrillo, Leila Kayser, Eva Levens, Clara Pichmans, Maud Stirne. The topic of AI and children was extremely important to us because I will start with a small anecdote that is maybe not important to you. I was trained as a child psychologist, and one of my first assignments was to go to social centers in Paris and to go around and try to teach about the pros and cons and also all the challenges of technologies and children. So I had mostly parents in front of me, and I could see during these occasions how maybe lost the parents were and how also used the children were when it comes to technology. So they might use them very well, but they might not understand them very well. They might not understand all the whereabouts, how it works, how it functions. And I think that's a bit of a metaphor, so to speak, I think for the idea that today children are growing up with AI around them. They're bathing in them. I think now their social services, a lot of the things that are also ruling their lives, so that can have an impact on their life, are also using AI. And we can see in Canada, for instance, recently, that also sometimes mistakes can occur and have a direct impact on them. So the focus of today will also have a special flavor about the rights of the children, what is the impact of AI, also how to make the protection of the fundamental rights of children coherent with the development of AI in a safe and ethical way. So I will start with a brief presentation of our speakers for today. I will start with you, Liliana. Liliana Carrillo is a computer science engineer with an MBA and a master's in artificial intelligence. Her background is in swarm intelligence and colony optimization, and family context has brought her to work on collective intelligence with an angle for diversity and inclusion. Liliana has founded Collective Up to work on tech, education, and inclusion to support the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and upgrade our collective intelligence, leaving no one behind. She has also founded A Bit of Future to create ethics, privacy by design, software solution, and promote digitally responsible practices. She is in Belgium, so if you are ever also interested in connecting, please do so. Professor Leila Kayser, she's the founder and director of IT Law Institute at Bilgi University since 2010 in Turkey. She has authored books, articles, and reports on computer forensics, e-signature, e-government, e-commerce, information security, biometrics, e-invoice, DRM, and I'm sorry that you cannot see her, but she's connected with her via Zoom, and she will talk to her also via Zoom. She's also the chairman of the e-signature National Coordination Board at Turkish Information, Communication and Telecommunication Authority, and she has worked extensively on the notion of privacy and children in different contexts, and specifically when it comes to AI. Now, Professor Eva Levens is an associate professor of law and technology at the Ghent University. She researches the legal impact of technology design and deployment, human and children's rights in a digital environment, and alternative regulatory instruments. Eva is a member of the Human Rights Center, the Management Committee of the Cost Action Global Digital Human Rights Network, the Chamber for Impartiality and the Protection of Minors of the Flemish Regulator for the Media. And she's also the steering board of the Flemish Knowledge Center for Media Literacy, MediaWes, and that I also encourage you to take a look at. Dr. Clara Pichmans is a consultant for Ally for UNICEF. She has a master's degree in business informatics, a PhD on value deliberation in complex decision-making processes. She's a co-author of the UNICEF's policy guidance on AI for children, which covers recommendations for governments and AI developers, guidance for educators, parents, and children. The policy guidance was developed in global consultation with experts on AI, children, and education, and was launched in December 2021. And currently, Clara works as an advisor at the Dutch National Growth Fund that stimulates innovation in research and education, where she focuses on innovation in security, safety, and digitalization. And Maud Stirnet, to finish, is a communication professional. She started her career in the company data publishing sector. 5 years ago, she created her own consultancy driven by her contacts with children and the will to connect dots between technologies and inclusive practices. She works with children's companies, NGOs on accessibility and responsible AI projects. She's part of Eurochild, a group of NGOs working with and for children in Europe. She's a co-chair of the Accessibility for Children community group at W3C, and Maud is especially interested in privacy concept by children and for children. So more or less, children's questions guide her work and will accompany her. So as you can see, we have a very diversified panel. Thank you for coming. And we will start with a few guiding questions. So the goal today is really to try to cover as much as possible some of the key questions and concerns, and also maybe try to highlight what is needed for the future when it comes to AI and children. So I will start with the first question to all of you, for our panelists. What are the major concerns when using AI in relation to children? And maybe I will start with you, Clara. As you work on the UNICEF and with UNICEF, highlights, maybe you have this also global view to maybe give us a bit of an insight on that.
Yes, is the microphone? Yeah, it works. Yes, thank you, Carl. So at UNICEF we had obviously many conversations to decide, okay, what should be in this guidance? And the first thing is indeed protection. Children should be protected, so there is a lot of AI that is developed, that is actually developed to do harm on children, that should be prevented. But there is also AI that is indirectly doing harm on children, for example, when social welfare needs to be allocated and data is biased. This can actually have a huge impact on children when the data is, is biased. But there can also be harm when children's privacy is not taken into account. So protecting children is one of the three topics of the guidance. But we thought it's not only about protecting children. Children should also be provided for. So by developing AI that, for example, is makes diagnosis less invasive, or that develops educational programs that take care of special needs for children, but that also provide them in leisure or play. And then there is the third part where we said, but they also should be able to participate. So we should make them part of the process. We should make them part of the design and give them a voice. So that is, those three were in general what we discussed. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And Eva, also, what could be the impact of AI on children's rights? Are you concerned, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you. I think when we look at children's rights, the framework that we always look at is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Was adopted in 1989, so a very long time ago. Very little AI was present at that time in children's lives. Now this has, of course, changed enormously. In order to be able to interpret children's rights in light of these technologies, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child adopted a general comment last year in March. And I think that this comment really shows that these types of technologies, just as Clara said, they can have both a very positive and also a very negative impact on the full range of children's rights. And what I think is important in the debate is that very often when we think about the impact of AI on children's rights, we immediately think of privacy, of data protection, of non-discrimination because of the risk of bias. But I think that we really should also look beyond these quite obvious rights and also think about the impact on freedom of thought of children, freedom to form opinions, protection from commercial exploitation, especially freedom of thought, is a real concern, I think, these days. For instance, because of dark patterns that are included in interfaces that steer children towards making decisions that are sometimes unconscious. Also, for instance, in the context of gaming, in video gaming environments. So I think it's really important to take a look at the impact on the full range of children's rights. And also, of course, not to forget the positive impact, for instance, on the right to education and the right to health. And then one other major concern that I have is actually at this moment in time, we know very little about the actual impact on children in the long term. So I really think that we need more longitudinal, empirical research that can learn policymakers something about what we need to regulate, because currently it's hard to understand the impact.
Thank you. And what you're saying is also making me think of the one among the 200 ethical declarations on AI, the notion of autonomy comes quite often. And another principle is also inclusion. So the question I have now for you, Tierney, is also, do you think there's a category of children that is maybe more at risk or for whom you have more concerns?
I will just start with a quote by children. I wonder why artificial intelligence should be trustworthy and children like me should be predictable. So this is a quote from one of my workshops with children on AI. And we saw in the discussion that for children, trust is, of course, a personal issue, a human quality that they usually know from their own experience. And I think when talking with children, it's always a good start to see how they understand concepts that are created by adults and to have a conversation on that. So when I think about concerns now, when I think like the most important is the conversation, but now I will introduce some concerns that I would have for specifically children with specific needs, having a diagnosis or not, or a disability or not. So I think we can start with the highest risk, like we do in legislation. We start with the highest possible risks in different sectors. Like I highlighted some in related to privacy. The first one is I thought about is on healthcare. I think it's very important we remember COVID lessons to avoid, for example, triage decisions with young people with disability who would have to hear they have lower scores if there isn't enough life-saving materials. In supply chain also, we have to be very careful that children with disabilities have different needs and profiles, so their supplies are different. In education, there's a lot about learning, but also a lot to think about in administrative decision making, actually. So, for example, exclusions are mostly impacting children with specific needs. More specifically, in the references we talked about, for children we talk, of course, about the Convention on the Rights of the Children, but the Convention on which protects children with disabilities is also very important. And so far in the guidelines, on children and AI, it's not so very mentioned. So although it's more ratified and more recent than the UN CRC. Another concern that we can talk about related to children is to be careful for unintended disability disclosure. In a recent study by the Council of Europe, children were asked if they, when children were asked, they said they did want to disclose their disability online because there was a fear of rejection, or they think it's a very personal issue. So they have their opinion on this. In more very specific functionalities, I think we can also find private elements, and the children can show their identity through functionalities that when they use AI. For example, when they're using voice assistants, maybe they want to have their own accent, or they want to be able to choose an avatar which looks like them or uses sign language like them or not. They want to have this flexibility.
Thank you very much. Leila, maybe also if you can hear us, and can you enlighten us on what are your thoughts, maybe also specifically, we said that privacy is a concern, but can you maybe elaborate on that or share your other thoughts? And hello, nice to meet you.
Thank you, Carl. Hello and good morning, everyone. More recent research suggests that by 2023, more than 275 million intelligent voice assistants, such as Amazon Echo or Google Home, will be installed in homes worldwide. Younger generations are growing up interacting with AI algorithms, yet little attention is paid to the impact of AI and related technologies on children. Although there are many benefits of AI in children's lives, there are also significant risks too, which are often faced when children try to benefit from tech, such as in the education context. These risks include as undermining children's rights to data protection and privacy. When considering the privacy aspect, it is very crucial to remember that children may not grasp the concept of privacy and therefore may disclose too much information to AI systems they interact with. Data protection and privacy breaches don't only undermine children's fundamental rights, but also can result in other severe risks, such as risks to their physical safety of the child in their interaction with AI-driven tech. There must be obligations for AI providers to protect privacy and data protection of the children, such as, for example, not using profiling techniques, or don't use child data for targeted advertising, and don't use dark patterns, and provide age-appropriate design, and use clear, plain, and understandable language for kids to explain privacy and data protection. Shortly, recognition that the user is a child, consideration for the capacity of and upholds the rights of children, and offer terms appropriate to children, and present information in an age-appropriate way, and offer a level of validation for service design decisions are important points in terms of creating appropriate privacy and data protection framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Liliana, to close this question, as you are at the intersection also of inclusion, the technical side that you also have uniquely in this panel, and education, can you please also share your thoughts on what are your concerns in light also with what was said before?
Thank you. Well, I have concerns, two kind of concerns, let's say from positive, negative impact on the negative AI and the positive AI, let's say. So on the side of the negative AI, if we go into the branch of advertisement, recommender systems, and so on, we basically see that from the technical perspective, the fact that the child is liking, or even us as adults are liking certain information, is bringing us to have a next recommendation of something similar, right? What happens in the longer term is that we are in a almost data funnel or an information funnel, making us like more and more certain topics, right? But this links actually with your concern, and it's also mine. It's the manipulation of information and the freedom of thoughts. What does it mean? It means actually that we will be all focused in only one type of thinking, right? And what does it mean? We are actually very difficultly being open-minded, because we don't have a very broad vision. We have a very narrow vision of the information that we are seeing, and that happens also to children. So the manipulation that is happening online with games, with advertisement and so on, is bringing kids and all of us to having a very narrow way of thinking. And that actually brings us to a very difficult polarization. So in the longer run, we are polarized. It's like we like A or we like B, and we are not from the same group. So that is actually has a very big impact. That is the branch of the, let's say, negative AI. Now, related to the concerns that I have regarding education and inclusion, I would say that I want to actually speak about the positive AI. There are many tools, AI-based tools, that are able already to support kids with special needs. For example, AI that can, with natural language understanding and processing, that can actually support kids who have, for example, stuttering disease or other kind of speech disabilities. And these games that are based on AI algorithms and natural language understanding can actually support them to improve their language, right? And to actually overcome their challenges. So this is the good AI, let's say. But then in this good AI, the thing is, this is a very expensive technology. The AI experts cost too much. So the challenge is actually, how are we going to democratize this technology in a way that all these amazing tools that already exist to support, for example, kids with disabilities and with special needs, that actually get to everyone. So then it's more the thoughts of, the negative side, but also the positive one. How are we going to make this good AI actually visible and accessible to people?
Thank you very much, and that leads me to the next question, being, I will take you up on your word. And now, okay, because you have thoughts on how to maybe design AI systems. So the question here is at the intersection of law and I think also the technical side, but any child now born will be influenced by AI. How do we ensure that the deployment of AI takes into account the children's fundamental rights? How do we do that in the design process? So maybe Liliane, as you just talked, maybe I will start with you, Maud. How do you assess the needs? Because it has to start from somewhere. How do you take the children's needs into account? How do you identify them?
Okay, it's good that I speak after Liliana because I can preach with your toes. So it's actually, well, you were speaking about the positive side of AI, really, and yeah, there is still some work to be done on this, but it's true that if we mutualize, that we think about accessibility, there are needs we can regroup that can be measurable in terms of accessibility. So there is work to be done that it's more cost effective. So really for their fundamental rights, I think it's very important, as you know, that we hear also children, that they can express themselves in reports and etc. on AI as well, and children with specific needs as well. So there we start having reports by the UN rapporteur, who did some very, very great effort on this, including children with disabilities and their needs, mostly in education and in healthcare at the moment. There are other topics we'll see later. And it's also very important on a higher level in the AI models that we really see that activities for children fit, that we have models that allow more flexibility, that we really can include and map communities, families, the sense of belonging even in a model, or systemics. So I remember I was at a webinar with a computer scientist, and during COVID he said, you know, I updated my model with children's activities during COVID because I was with my children, and I just saw I forgot to include that part, and I found it really great that this enhancement happened by experience. But I think it's good not to forget it in the long run. Also, I just to go back to the needs of the children themselves, not only in the models, but when designing autonomous systems, there are also still a bit of research gaps, because most research actually does not take into account a missing sense like deafness or blindness. And we also know that foundational experiences from the little ones are important to take into account, even if they are not online yet. But for example, for children, like joint attention for learning, when you look at an object together and the adult shows it and the child has to watch at the same time, and so the process of language is starting. This is really background research that is very important for blind children, but that can also be useful for other children. And I think this is something we can already act upon now. In my community group at W3C, we work on referencing these gaps, this research gap, but we also encourage further research, and we check fundamental needs to upgrade the accessibility guidelines that are really used worldwide to make sure the web and the technologies using AI are designed so that children with disabilities can also use and benefit from them. But for children, you know, we also rely a lot on universal design principle. And this is really also very important to include, as we said, to mutualize needs and see that we can help a lot of users from the start. What I think also we can say, for children, it's also very important. I haven't seen a lot of studies on that. It's the difference between adults' need and children's need online. We say we insist a lot on the safety for children, which is paramount, of course. But when we look deeper, we see that, for example, they have different navigation, exploration styles. There are also different proportionalities in needs. So some children with disabilities have problems occurring in childhood that are different, that disappear in adulthood. Children are less predictable. And they also need more feedback options when they are in a tool anywhere on the web or in contact with a chatbot, for example. And there's one latest thing I wanted to say for this matter is that there's a recent study on assistive technology that came out, and that really shows a lot of information on AI, how really the technology is used for children in a positive way in healthcare, but there is still a lot of training needed. For example, children having a robot to distract them from treatment, they need there is some preparation work needed with the parents, with the child, to make sure that the child feels at ease. This doesn't come in one day, and this has to be supported also. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry. And Leila, maybe also looking at what Maud just said about the universal design principles. You have worked a lot and been committed towards more ethical awareness around AI's impact on children, including ethical and legal principles. What are your thoughts on how to design system in such a way to protect children's fundamental rights?
Thank you, Carl. It is important to recognize the role of adopting a clear, comprehensive framework for corporations that putting the duty to those who are responsible in dealing with children's data and provides an effective remedy for any breach. Such a framework can only be rights-respecting and effective form and ethical point of view if it incorporates human rights principles. Data protection and design-related tools are a good way to start thinking about how the deployment of AI systems can take rights and freedoms into account. All frameworks and applications should be in the best interest of the child. To do that, my another hat is I work at the Council of Europe Committee on AI to draft a convention on AI systems. To that extent, we proposed human rights, democracy, and the rule of law impact assessment, shortly we called HUDERIA. And within that framework, we also suggested child rights impact assessment. And child rights impact assessment is the specific form of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law impact assessment, which aims to protect fundamental rights of children for the whole life cycle of AI systems, not only during deployment or design of AI systems. On the other side, we have some new developments to answer that question. For example, IEEE published shortly Child Standard based on 5 rights principles for children, which is a framework developed with young people by the 5 Rights Foundation that set out 5 principles that establish children's entitlement in the digital world. This includes the right to remove, right to know, right to safety and support, the right to informed and conscious use, and the right to digital literacy. To concretize that principles for AI providers and other relevant stakeholders, 5 Rights Organization published last week a global child online safety toolkit. And this toolkit provides a roadmap for keeping kids safe online. This is a hands-on, comprehensive how-to guide for making the online world free for harm for children. And it is also freely accessible, and you can download it at the childonlinesafetytoolkit.org. So these are the important points which have to be taken into account during the whole life cycle of AI systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that's a nice segue to also think about upcoming regulation. And I think, Eva, you have the expertise and the right views also on that. So do you think, for instance, the upcoming AI Act will provide some cues? How do you see that coming?
Yes, so the good news is that the proposal for the AI Act that was proposed by the European Commission last year, that it acknowledges the importance of ensuring the protection of the rights of the child. So there are references to the UNCRC, to Article 24 of the Charter of the EU. And actually, if you look at the proposal, children are referred to in 2 articles. So the AI Act works with levels of risks and accompanying requirements. And so one type of AI systems that children are referred to is in relation to the prohibited practices. So the Commission proposes to prohibit certain practices, and one of these types of practices is when systems exploit vulnerabilities of people, for instance, based on their age. So, and this is a clear reference to children. When these systems materially distort the behavior and lead to physical or psychological harm. So these types of practices will be prohibited. And I think in this context of prohibiting certain practices, like we mentioned before, today it's still very hard to assess whether certain systems actually do lead to harm. And of course, if you want to regulate something, you need to have some kind of indication that this is behavior or a system or a practice that needs to be regulated. But in the context of children's rights, I think the precautionary principle can be really important. This precautionary principle is actually a principle that finds its origins in environmental policy. So it's kind of better safe than sorry approach that compels society to act cautiously if there are any indications, even if they are not absolute, that a certain system can lead to harm regarding children's rights. So I think when we think about what a legislator should prohibit, that this precautionary principle is very important. I think it's already good that in this article on prohibited practices there is a link to children, but I think perhaps it could still be thought about more also in consultation with children and how they see it, because they also have very valuable insights on that. Then a second part, or a second type of systems where children are mentioned are the high-risk systems. So systems that could lead to, or that embody a high risk. There it says that in the risk management requirements for providers, that the rights of the child should be taken into account, and that specific consideration should be given to whether such a high-risk AI system is likely to be accessed or have an impact on children. And I think there I can also refer to what Leila said. I think in this context, it would be really important to use child rights impact assessments, so the type of impact assessments that we already know a lot about, that UNICEF also regularly uses, in order to be able to assess the impact on the full range of children's rights. When we are talking about these high-risk systems, because in the annex there are references to systems in the context of education, migration, and this can also really concern children in their day-to-day lives. And then one other important aspect, I think, and this is criticism on the proposal for an AI Act in general, not only in relation to children, is that there is very little attention to individual rights. So it's about requirements for providers, for users, for putting these systems in the market. But unlike, for instance, the GDPR, there is very little that one can do if rights are violated. So I think this is something that might still change in the process, and that also would be important for children, so that they also have these rights and can act.
Thank you. That leads me also to the question of when we hear privacy by design, legal by design, ethics by design. When we talk to technical experts, they might also sometimes think, you know, it sounds also hard to implement, or they can have also doubts about how is it feasible for me. And reading the AI Act, big principles, it might seem disconnected from sometimes what they can do at their own level. So maybe Liliana, as you have the double hat of the technical but also the educational part, how would you approach the question of embedding children's fundamental rights in the design?
Well, I will make a comparison actually with something that we all know. When we go to school, often we get sexuality lessons, right? At some point in our school, we get education about how to protect ourselves, what are the risks of having sex, and what are the risks in general, right? I think that on that parallel, we should also have something like that already at the schools. Like saying, look, gaming, for example, for children is fun. These are the risks. It doesn't mean that the risks that we are going to solve them, they are there, but it's like, how are we going to protect ourselves, right? And it is also the decision of the child, but with good information. Then going a little bit on the technology side, I have to say that there is already technology that can allow us to protect our data and to accept, to consent actually to share or not our data. And that is even, again, in the parallel of sexuality, it's something very important that we actually consent or not to an act, right? So then going to this digital world and going into the digital twins and digital footprint basically is how are we going to make this happen, this consent happen, that when we go to a platform or when a child goes to a platform, they don't even have to read that much, but that they know where their data is stored, if that is, in a server in the United States, is it in a server in Europe, is it compliant to GDPR or not? Now, is this data being processed or not? Then all those facts. And basically going into the consent phase of this data, there is a very important standard that is being pushed actually by the Flemish government and in general by Europe in one or another way. And this is the SOLID standard that is really by design already supporting us to have data vaults in a way that we can consent or not to sharing our data. And it's a system where we can already see all our data linked and what is being shared or not. But of course, this is already in processing, this is still being in deployment phase and so on. And how are we going to make the systems also accessible for kids? Some don't even read, or even us. It seems that only 80%, that most of us, 80% of us, don't even read the terms and conditions of any platform that we actually are part of. So if we already don't read the terms and conditions, how are we going to make this even easier for kids in a way that they know what is happening with their data? Right? So then it's, on one hand, the data, like what is happening with this data and the representation of that child in the digital world, that it's, in technology, we call that the digital twin, right? Or, on the other hand, the educational branch. How are we going to create those educational programs and make them more accessible in a way that people, teachers, educators, parents actually understand also the risks of technology and AI.
All right, thank you. And I think the last piece that is missing to have a complete view on this question is also from the policy point of view, the international policy point of view. Given your work with UNICEF, what do you think is recommendable, advisable at a general level?
Yeah, so we already heard a lot, so I think this is a little bit summarizing in a bit more high level. So first is to apply the fundamental child rights on any system that interacts with or impacts children. And then, as you already said, I started with the UNICEF guidance focuses on protection, provision, and participation. But these can also have some tension in between. So to protect children is maybe not in the same way as to provide children in one system. So so those tensions between those should be acknowledged and should be addressed. Another overall recommendation is to adapt the system to national and local context of children. And then there is a number of recommendations. So the first one is to support well-being. So prioritize how AI can benefit children. But then also the inclusion of and for children. So develop with diverse teams, but also include children in the design process. And if you do that in a meaningful way. So don't just have a children's panel and say, okay, we addressed children, but make that meaningful. Then focus on fairness and non-discrimination. So support the most marginalized, use diverse data sets. Then what we discussed a lot already is to protect children's data and privacy, use data in a responsible way, privacy by design indeed, and protect the data at a group level. Then ensure safety, so assess and monitor the impact of AI on children, test for safety, security and robustness. Another one is focus on transparency, explainability and accountability. You also said this, use age-appropriate language so that children can understand what they agree with. Then governments and businesses, they should be empowered to actually understand that what they are building, what that does to children and how that infers with children's rights. So there should be capacity building on that. And then the next point will also be in the next question, prepare children for the present and future developments in AI. So that's more about how do you address this in education. And what's also important to, as a final remark, is to enable an environment for child-centered AI. So that means, for example, invest in research, but also support infrastructural developments to address, for example, the digital divide. So these are in the UNICEF policy guidance what we have as recommendations.
Thank you very much. And indeed, there is the next question that is about specifically education. So we heard from our panelists a lot of, I think, critical points, critical concerns. I think specific elements that we should focus on from a technical side, policy side, legal side. But one distinction that I really love, Eva, that you made when we talked was also there is a difference between being informed and being educated. And I think, Eva, if you had maybe some thoughts to share on that, I think the question of education is often understood as we just provide information or we just put a lot of information on the website or on the different things. Does not necessarily mean that it's either understood, that it's enactable, and so forth. So maybe I leave you the floor to maybe guide us on that to start the question.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, the distinction was not between being informed and being educated, but I really do believe that being informed or being educated does not amount to being protected. I totally agree that education and literacy can be extremely powerful for children, that it's absolutely necessary to teach them basics of how such systems might work. But actually, many of the systems are so complex and so opaque that in many cases, it is not really fair to put this burden on the shoulders of children and parents to understand how this system works and to expect from them that they understand what the impact might be on their rights. So this is something that we have advocated for in quite some of our articles, de-responsibilization of children and parents. And of course, this immediately means oh, it's a very difficult word. I always struggle with it. So, re-responsibilization of policymakers, legislators, regulators, industry. It's actually they who should take the best interest of the child as a guiding principle when decisions are made about how to deal with these systems, how to put the systems on the market. So I think there is a tension. I think we definitely need literacy and education, but it should not put too much of a burden on children and their parents.
Okay, thank you very much. And so also thank you for clarifying the distinction. It adds another more interesting layer. Maud, I also wanted to hear you maybe on the idea that education should maybe by default be inclusive, and that's also something that you believe in. What action should be prioritized in that regard?
I think what we see, first of all, in guidelines that we would need to have, first of all, a common language on concepts. Because, for example, if you go into a room with a children's rights specialist and a developer, the children rights specialist will talk about chatbots and conversational AI, and the developer will be talking about natural language interfaces. So how do you bridge those two, and how do you map these concepts? Because it's very important. If you have a text at some place that speaks about one concept, you have to merge the examples for children as well somewhere, and put them into context so that everything is linked. But also, as you said, to have an inclusive literacy on AI. I think we have some AI in the governmental curriculum. UNESCO made a list, but I think we need more if we want to reach more people and more children, to disseminate projects in inclusive communities. I think there are interesting initiatives like the data walks that are hybrid. So it's really important for children to be outdoors and also at the same time understand things about cameras and ask questions about what is AI, what it isn't, and understand more, but through experience in their real life. Co-creation is very important as well, even in the lesson making, even in creating a learning environment. I know, for example, I was contacted by young people at the Council of Europe. They had a training on AI, and they asked me to go and give them a training on responsible AI and accessibility. And my first advice will be, please help co-create the next guidelines. I also have a few elements that I add when I do in my workshop that are very practical. I'm pragmatic, I guess. I go back to basics with children. So when I work on biometrics, and I explain biometrics to children, yes, I teach sensory literacy. I teach the senses that they know from classroom. And then we are explaining the links with sensor, and we explain the difference between human and machines, and we ask questions, and we work around all these topics. But we go back to what they know, their experience, and their environment. Also, I think Liliana talked about the term of consent. There are actually consent forms that are accessible, that have been designed, that can be used anywhere. And there is an easy reading website with work packages on privacy, on ethics and safety, and that are all accessible and downloadable.
Thank you. And maybe, Leila, also to delve then into a concrete example, for instance, about privacy. How would you then approach the educational part? What is your take on it?
Education and raising awareness can be key to protect children in today's AI-driven world. Our research at Bilgi IT Law Institute 2 years ago showed us how important teacher-parent awareness can be in children's understanding of their rights to data protection and privacy, and also their engagement with technology. We also explored the vital role schools educators can play in not only protecting, but also empowering children. Going back to parents and legal guardians, we can see that they often don't have the information or capabilities to ensure their child's safety and privacy. Therefore, it is important to listen to their voices and work together with a multi-stakeholder approach, develop partnerships with private sector, public authorities, schools, engaging with children and parents themselves to raise awareness and improve digital and more specifically AI literacy. At the end, I would like to stress, like Eva, the responsibility of parents and legal guardian, but real responsibility of governments, private sector, and other relevant stakeholders. And hope I pronounced them correctly, Eva. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Clara, then also to pick up on what you were saying, You said it's key, and in the report of UNICEF, to prepare children for present and future development in AI. Can you give us more specifics on what it entails?
Yeah, so this entails first the education of children, and indeed the burden shouldn't be too much on children, but educating them in AI does help. So the guidance would stimulate technical knowledge on AI, but also always in combination with soft skills, so that children also learn how to think critical about the AI they use, and that they understand the consequences of AI that's being built or that they will build, so that they understand also the context in which this is used. So this is about education of the systems. But they should also, this education will also prepare them for jobs that don't exist yet. So this will also help them in, well, being educated for the future. So that's for the education of children. But then the teachers obviously need to teach them this. So the teachers that are still in training, in Brazil they already have a national self-assessment for teachers that they have to take every year, just to check what the levels of AI knowledge are. And then teachers that are already in service, they could, for example, take basic level courses as the elements of AI that are readily available. And then indeed parents. Yeah, what can you do with parents? Well, giving them huge books of AI wouldn't help. So, but at UNICEF, we made this very little booklet to say, okay, ask your children about AI and how they use it, and make them aware of that what you do with your data. That you should be careful with that. And we also made this little booklet for children, which is, well, almost the same, but then in reverse, where we also say, okay, share with care, but also challenge your teachers, because you might actually know more than your teachers. So ask them, okay, what are we doing with AI and why do we do this? So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. And Liliana, I will give you a special role because as also you forgot to mention that you're the co-founder of the European Digital Development Alliance, whose aim is to influence digital and tech policies to reduce the digital divide within outside the EU. You also have a special role in education as you design also educational content for European projects and also now in Belgium around this topic. So how would you answer this multi-layer question of education?
Well, the gap is actually very big. The knowledge gap is very big. So on one hand, we are trying to support actually to reduce that gap by creating educational resources. But then we go, for example, to teachers and schools, and we realize actually that the gap is too big, that the teachers actually don't know. And most of the people even that are working in the European projects, I work for UN European funded project called Fostering Artificial Intelligence at the schools. But even within the partnership, there are not many AI experts. So then the gap is so big that what I am personally doing is actually sharing knowledge. For example, I have supported the European Commission to create content for the elements of AI and for the digital skill platform, Revolution, the course of Revolution, digital revolution, and so on. But at the end of the day, it's, I would say that I go back in a way to the conclusion of this is not just on kids or on parents. This is really about the ecosystem, right? It's a very difficult, very advanced knowledge, and it cannot be only on parents and teachers, right? It cannot be. It's just too difficult to understand the mathematics and the black box that there is in these systems, and there are many layers that need to be tackled. For example, going into requiring companies to actually open that black box and really say what the algorithm is actually doing behind the scenes, right? So it's from all layers something needed. But on one hand, I would say, just to close, let's say, my intervention, that we need to study actually ourselves. So going, for example, to elements of AI is one of the possibilities, even though this course is not created for children yet, right? It's not accessible to children, but that is already one step, that we, all of us, that not most of us are actually literate in AI, that we start to do it. And that is already a lot.
Yeah. All right. And thank you very much for all your thoughts. As also, it's a pleasure to be back in the real world, to not have cameras shut down when we talk. And I will also invite you, I will ask first the panelists, but you also think of this question, what is missing when we speak about AI and children? That you all try to think about this. But also, I liked a distinction that was made, what do we have too much of right now when it comes to AI and children? And maybe to start with that, and also as this session is sponsored by AI for Belgium, the federal initiative, we also want to know what is missing, what is still needed, and what do we need to put more emphasis on. And I will maybe start with you, Leila, as you are afar. Maybe what is for you still critically missing, or what do we have too much of right now?
Thank you, Carl. What can be missing is a holistic approach where different fields of law and vulnerability aspects that affect children's engagement with AI-driven tech, as well as their exercise of their rights, are taken into account. Such layers include, but not limited to, age-appropriate and gender-sensitive approaches. The documents and the relevant materials and guidelines, for example, age-appropriate design code, underscores the importance of equality law aspect, which can be taken as a best practice example. Also, let's recall that before we start any discussion, it is of utmost importance to understand what child best interests mean and discuss how this can be translated into practice. To achieve this, a good understanding of UNCRC rights and understanding of both legal and technical frameworks are crucial. Although there is significant development in the field, there is still a lot to do to raise awareness about these matters and come up with solutions that will protect and empower children in today's AI-driven world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I will ask the four panelists if we can also be as concise, to then leave the floor to maybe hear your thoughts from the audience, and also if you have questions. So maybe, Eva, legally speaking, you also hinted that there is maybe an increasing complexity. Is it something that needs to be dealt with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think many of you are aware that it's really a full-time job these days to keep up with all the documents and initiatives that are proposed by the European Commission. In this area, we have GDPR, we have the Digital Services Act, we have the proposal for an AI Act. The Commission issued also a notice on the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive with a lot of attention for dark patterns, video gaming. In the Better Internet for Kids Plus strategy that was very recently released, there is a proposal to design an EU age-appropriate design code, also what Leila referred to. And actually, my worry is what will be the interplay and the overlap between those instruments, or perhaps there will still be gaps. Many providers of AI systems will possibly be subject to all of these instruments. And in all of them, there is some attention for children, but in my opinion, still too little and too fragmented.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe Maud?
Yeah, well, maybe I can add pragmatic thought to what you said. I was thinking, do we have initiatives doing this, like linking the different tools and guidelines? I recently came across an initiative from the Alan Turing Institute. They really want to gather all guidelines, and I sent a note to make sure that they would focus on guidelines for children as well, that they would integrate these. in their tool. I know AI for Belgium is also making a tool on trustworthy AI. So all these tools that we can have where we can integrate guidelines for children, and that we can help bridge links between guidelines and make it easier for people to integrate good practice. I think we have to really encourage that at the moment.
Thank you. Liliana?
Too much information actually out there, too complex, so simplifying, making it more understandable to people.
Okay, thank you. Clara?
In all this complexity shows that it's very difficult to do this. So what I think, well, it's not missing, but it's, we need more of it, is best practices. And as Eva already mentioned at the beginning, longitudinal research on this. So.
All right, thank you. So now the floor is yours. Do you have any thoughts? Because we also want to hear from the audience. After hearing maybe all of that, do you have thoughts? Is there something missing? Or do you have questions more simply for the panelists? Yes, please, you can go to the microphone, or the microphone comes to you, apparently. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. First of all, it was a pleasure to listen. My question was specifically for Liliana, but broadly for the rest of the panel. There was a comparison made at a certain point between sexual education and then educating children with the risks of artificial intelligence and data gathering, and that children should be taught about risks and taught about consent. How would you propose to combat this wave of new age parents who are against, say, sexual education and the teaching of critical race theory, if we use the US as an example, and this belief that these sorts of things shouldn't be necessarily mandated in a federal sense, but should be taught in the home? Thank you.
Well, that's an interesting question, because I'm actually also in the branch of self-directed education, which means the child is actually responsible in freedom, but in a safety environment for their own education. So it's a really very extreme kind of education that we don't have actually in Europe. Meaning that the first step is actually give to the child the freedom to operate, and they have the responsibility of their life, right? But that is in the conditions of safety. So as adults, we are the providers for a safety environment so this child can operate in freedom and discover the world in a safety way, right? So it means that, for example, if you have a toddler and the toddler is exploring here and there, if we see that there is a knife on the floor, we are going to take out the knife and actually let the child still move around, but there is no knife, there is no actual danger in the room, right? So I think that on one hand, the dangers are there, right? So it's the matter of letting the kid know, or the children know, that there are dangers outside, but not to go totally in the scare mode of this is fear, the world is full of fear, and it's going to be wrong. No. In a way, there are many experts already working on AI. We are trying to create a safe environment in one or another way. The technology just developed so fast, especially in the last 10, 20 years, that it has gotten out of hands, right? So we are trying now actually to fix it. It's not that we intended to do bad to humanity. We are trying to fix it because I really think that we are, in essence, good people. We actually want a good environment for everyone, right? So, but then the conclusion for me is, on one hand, I believe a lot in freedom and self-responsibility, personally, but I think that the safety has to be there. So, especially for children, we can give them the freedom to explore, but there has to be a certain safety. And that is what we have been speaking actually today, that safety net to protect them.
Thank you. Yes, any thoughts on that on the panel as well, or maybe things to add? please, yeah.
Maybe just one small comment that there is, of course, a lot of responsibility on governments to put these types of literacy and education in the official curricula and the lesson plans of schools. And I think, for instance, if I look at Flanders, it has been a very long and tough road to integrate media literacy, digital literacy, possibly in the future AI literacy in these lesson plans. But slowly but surely we managed to get it. So, and of course, if this is an official goal that needs to be reached in education, then there will also be a higher demand for these educational resources. And so, but that is, I think, an important prerequisite.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any other questions or comments, concerns about AI? No? All right, yes, please.
So, good afternoon. So at the beginning of the discussion, you guys were talking about dark patterns and then freedom of thought on the other hand. And I think this is a very interesting debate around rights, proposed rights like cognitive liberty or mental integrity. And I'm wondering specifically with the Charter of Fundamental Rights, what legal argument do you think there is for cognitive liberty beyond a mere textual analysis?
Thank you. Eva, maybe, and Clara, or no? Okay.
It's a very, very interesting question, and I would love for more people to be interested in doing research about this, also fundamental research in how we can interpret freedom of thought as it is integrated in many human rights documents, but also, for instance, in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. In our research group, there is a PhD candidate who has done quite some research on the very close link between the right to receive information, how this is affected by increasing personalization and recommendation algorithms, the freedom to form opinions, because of course to form opinions there is this close link with the information that you receive, and the link to freedom of thought. And I think this is something that has really been missing also in scholarship. There often has been very extensive attention for the right to freedom of expression, the right to privacy, non-discrimination, but attention for freedom of thought, freedom to form opinions has been much scarcer. I see quite some things are happening, slowly but surely, also especially because there is more attention for these types of dark patterns, both from a consumer protection perspective, from a data protection perspective. The EDBB has also recently released guidelines or proposed guidelines on dark patterns. So I think this is really growing the attention, and I think it's really crucial.
All right, thank you. Yes, please. So if that's okay, could you move? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Teresa from University of Vienna, and I kind of want to relate to that question. I'm personally developing a PhD on the right to personal development of children and data for education, and I'm from Germany, and there we have this beautiful Article 2, Recht auf freie Entfaltung der Persönlichkeit. In English, it's like free development of the personality. And I'm kind of looking at these questions. I think it's very abstract, also in Germany still, like what is free development of the personality. But I think in German law we have quite a few also connected to the right to informational self-determination, which also then builds on this idea that we need to protect or restrict data to allow free development of the personality, which I find like super interesting idea. And I agree that there's something that has not been focused so much so far, but in particular, and also Article 27 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child mentions personal development as an objective of education, which again, I think there's this link. Yeah.
Thank you, and I think it connects to the points that were made about autonomy. How do you protect and preserve autonomy? And I think either in the safe environment, I saw some hands raised. Who wants to start first? Liliana, maybe, and then Eva.
Well, I actually want to ask ourselves even what is freedom of thoughts. Why? Because by developing a course of a training actually on unconscious bias, 99% of our decisions, daily decisions in every moment, actually are made unconscious. So basically, our mind is already not very free. I mean, we are very wired to actually make really decisions that are super efficient. So our brain is amazing. We can see this glass and we know, okay, this is to drink water, you know, because we have already that information safe and it's really quick. So that's amazing from our brain. But it makes also the challenge of, is that freedom? How much we have to work actually on our unconsciousness to make it conscious in a way that we can speak really about freedom.
Sorry,
right? Freedom
I think we got the message that maybe 10 seconds to finish the argument.
Oh, God.
I apologize. I'm sorry. I was taken up by the conversation. So maybe, Eva, maybe if you can... No? Okay.
I was just going to refer to Article 6 of the Convention as well, in relation to development and the right of development of a child. And also there's so much is still to be done, but really interesting.
So I apologize, this was a bit cut off, but I think for the sake of time for everybody else after, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to our panelists. Can you give them a round of applause? Thank you to Air for Belgium and CPDP.